So the exam is now written and submitted to the department for review. The structure is exactly the same as test 2. So there'll be 10 short answer questions from which you will select 6 this time. That's the only difference. Sorry, not exactly the same. 6 short answer questions selected from 10, and then you'll select 1 out of 3 essay questions and then write an essay on it. I should say that the standards of evaluation do kind of go up as we go along through the course on the bold presupposition that you've learned and developed by taking the course. I mean, if you've gotten anything out of this, you should be better at these tasks than when you started. So this will be the most rigorous evaluation of the 3, the first 2 tests and the exam. The exam will be the most rigorously marked, but it's marked in the same way as the first 2. That is, the expectations are the same. In the sense of like what I'm looking for. Yeah.
When's the exam?
It's a fair question, which I hesitate to answer because I have this thing where I often get small but important details like that wrong. So I think you're better off looking it up yourself than trusting me. I once ran a midterm for a class of about 120 people and sent out an email to all of them being like, please show up at 10 a.m., but the test was actually at 11. And I realized that 3 a.m. the night before in a fit of horror. So after that, I really hesitate to, anytime I can avoid giving people the date themselves, they get it themselves. So yeah.
It's on
August 19th at 9 a.m., the man says. I believe him, he seems trustworthy. Yeah, okay, so yeah. Okay, it'll be 3 hours. No aids are allowed. Any questions about that? Any questions about the exam stuff? Yeah.
Are you still going to have office hours like next week and stuff?
Yes, so I'll set up at least 1 meeting of office hours. I'll do a couple of hours of office hours. I'm not exactly sure how my week next week is going to go, so I'll make an announcement as soon as I do know. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I'll do at least 1 set of office hours for questions about the exam or picking up your tests if you haven't done that already, or questions about your final essay if you still haven't submitted that kind of thing. So yeah, there'll be at least 1 set of office hours, which I'll announce on Quarkus. Other questions? Okay, then shall we get into it? Oh yeah, please do fill out your course evaluations. Those things are open. They always do this in the, they always make you fill them out before you know your final mark in the course, and they don't tell me what you said until after I've given you your final marks, so that nobody can wreak revenge on each other via marks or evaluations. Well, not based on final marks anyway. It seems like a good system to me, but. So yeah, please do fill those out. Yeah?
I think a slightly better system would be after the final exam.
Yeah.
But before you get your marks, so you can actually comment on the
Right.
entirety of the course and whether you felt prepared by the end of it.
Right, yeah.
But still, so you can't just say, I didn't get a good mark, I'm sad.
Right, right. I'll pitch that. If they ever ask me how course evaluation should go, I'll pitch that as a good idea. Okay. Any other questions about exam, final essay, that kind of thing? No, we're good? Okay, good. Okay, so to quickly review, what is it that we were doing? Well, we were talking about relevance last time. Last time we specifically homed in on the question of relevance, and we asked the following question: what if instead of letting relevance cause our theories to crash and burn, we actually tried to figure out relevance itself? So that's what we did last time. We tried to come up with a theory, not of relevance, but of relevance realization. That is our ability to figure out what's relevant in a context. We saw the argument that relevance is not something that's going to be fixed and stable in the ways that you want the objects of your scientific theories to be fixed and stable. So relevance realization maybe is a better thing to study than relevance itself. And that argument proceeded on a fairly extended analogy with fitness. So fitness is likewise not a thing that's stable across contexts. So your fitness as an organism is not you can't pin down, you can't just write down a list of the things that make you fit. Not even, and somebody suggested this last time, not even having like reproductive organs that are likely to generate offspring. Like that's actually not relevant for huge amounts of the animal world. Like huge amounts of species reproduce asexually, but B, species like bees and ants and humans often get our genes into the next generation by supporting our kin and our fellow humans, and that's how we do it. So there doesn't seem to be anything. If it's not like reproduction seems like if it was anything that would be correlated with fitness, it would be that. That's not even correlated with fitness. So there's really nothing that you can say that's just like, this is what makes you fit. Nonetheless, we seem to have a theory of evolution, right? We seem to have a theory about that involves fitness in some way, just not a theory of what makes you fit specifically. So on that analogy, maybe we can talk about relevance realization as a kind of dynamical theory, which is what the theory of evolution by natural selection is. Evolution by natural selection is the theory that populations stay fitted to their environment across time by being constrained by a couple of different types of constraints. You've got the generative constraints, the constraints that throw up new possibilities like mutation and recombination through sexual reproduction, that kind of thing. And actually, 21st biology is discovering a whole bunch of new ways. Like, for example, did you ever wonder, like, every cell in your body has the same genes, but some of those cells are making skin, and some of them are making livers, and some of them are making bones? Do you ever wonder about that? It's because that your genetic code can do a bunch of different things. And so one of the ways that nature throws up new possibilities is just by the same genes acting in new and interesting ways. And there's not really a fixed limit on the different ways that your genes can act. Anyway, so those are enabling constraints, constraints that generate new possibilities. And then there's the constraints in the normal sense of constraint of narrowing down the possibilities by things like natural selection and competition for resources. So there's two interacting constraints, one set generating possibilities, one set narrowing them down. And we suggested that something like that might be going on. So that kind of theory, this type of theory, which is a dynamical systems theory in the really robust sense that Alicia Herrero talked about. So remember, Alicia Herrero talked about dynamical systems theories as theories that involve these constraints guiding the system's change through time. So what we're interested in is not the steady state of the system, but how it changes over time. And maybe we can come up with a theory of relevance realization that's got that kind of structure, where it's instead of coming up with a theory of relevance, we come up with a theory of how we continue to stay fitted to our cognitive world across time by operating under some dynamical constraints. And then I suggested to you, maybe here are some of the dynamical constraints that might operate on us as we try to stay cognitively fitted to our world. That is, we've got, this is my term again, a machine, you're a kind of machine swarm. The way Verveake says it is your brain is the kind of machine that changes what kind of machine it is. So your brain is a mechanism in some sense. It's a purely mechanical object operating according to purely mechanical rules, but it's not just one kind of machine. It is, in fact, a whole bunch of machines operating in a kind of ecosystem where those machines that are best fitted to your cognitive needs are the ones that, in some sense, survive and persist in your mind, and those ones that aren't doing their job properly are sort of dropped out. And the dynamic balance that they're operating under is the following. It is the balance between generalization and particularization. So recall we talked way back in the problem-solving section about heuristics. Heuristics are guesses about what's going to be relevant. They're guesses about what's relevant in a problem situation, right? So in some sense, a heuristic is an answer to the question, what's relevant here, right? If you've got a heuristic for dealing with a situation, you're like, I bet this is going to be relevant. Heuristics can be more general. They can apply more widely. But the more general they are, the less likely they are to be efficient, to do a really good job at any one task situation. Or they can be very particular. You can have a heuristic that's exactly for one precise situation. So it's okay. People are milling around stealing education. That's okay. It's free to all. So you can have a more general or a more particular heuristic, and whichever heuristic, if a heuristic is doing really well in a cost-benefit sort of way, then it gets to stay. And if it's doing poorly in a cost-benefit sort of way, then it doesn't get to stay. And that cost, in some sense, is fairly easy to explain here. Cost is biological cost, metabolic cost. How many calories does your brain have to burn to run the heuristic? So that's the cost side. And then the benefit side is a little trickier, but we had a way of talking about this. But hang on one sec. Yeah?
Kind of unclear whether or not we covered these. Did we at all mention where these heuristics come from?
We didn't. We didn't. It's not really in the paper. We talked after class a little bit about this, where we can imagine a few different scenarios. So one possible scenario, and I think this has to be at least part of the answer, you got to have something built in, right? Your brain, you must come, babies clearly come into the world with learning strategies that they use. And it's not just random like sampling of the environment. Babies are clearly sampling their environment in a biased way to try to build models of their experience. So you got some models built in, and then perhaps here's one story that you could tell. There's a kind of developmental process from a small collection of like seed heuristics that then get developed and refined and changed and into more and more complex heuristics. So that's one story that you can tell. Some kind of developmental story is necessary, because this is precisely, I mean, if it's like evolutionary theory, it's precisely a story about change in the population of heuristics across time. Yeah?
Those fixed heuristics evolving in complexity, or are they spawning new little heuristics?
Well, I think either is a plausible story. Probably they're dividing and sort of like, so you got one general learning heuristic that you got built in, and then you find that this part of the heuristic works really well for language-like tasks, and this one works really well for movement, body-like tasks, so you sort of have a division between the two. I'm speculating here because there's not really a story in the paper, but there's a few constraints here, right? So you know that you can't be a pure blank slate. You know you can't just start with absolutely nothing, because then you've got nowhere to ground your learning process. It's got to start from somewhere, and so there must be some built-in heuristics. They can either be fixed, there can be some like fixed across your life, or they could be ones that sort of evolve and change. You know that by the end of your life, you've got a whole bunch of heuristics because of the complexity and diversity of tasks you can deal with, so probably they're splitting. Yeah. So that's the rough picture that I think is plausible. There's not much in the paper about this though. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Huh? Okay, so we talked about the cost side of this equation, literally biological cost, literally calories being burned by your brain. How hard is it for you metabolically to do this? Because that's the real constraint. That's the real finitary predicament that we're in, right? If you had a brain that was infinitely large and had infinite number of calories to deal with, then you wouldn't care about the metabolic cost of doing a heuristic. You could just burn calories indiscriminately. The fact is, we're limited beings. We have limited amount of energy, limited amount of time. So the cost is literally metabolic cost. I'm going to stop saying literally quite so much. Okay, but then benefit is a little less clear, right? So that's the stuff that we did this diversion into autopoiesis to talk and think a little bit about the benefit side of this equation, this economic cost-benefit analysis that your brain's doing of its various heuristics. Autopoiesis is the idea that every living thing is also in some basic sense a cognitive thing, because what you are, the definition of life these people propose, people like Thompson, Mascherano, and Varela, the definition of being a living thing is to generate a semi-permeable boundary inside which you have made all of your own parts and which interacts with the universe in a selective way, choosing and modulating your interactions with the universe to keep yourself as a unity, to continue on with this semi-permeable boundary. And that generates, they argue, a kind of a simple form of normativity that applies to every living thing. So there's something, what counts as food for you and what counts as poison is relative to your semi-permeable boundary and the way that you've made your parts. So for me, cyanide is poison. For some bacteria living in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, it's food. And that just depends on how you're internally constituted, which means that for me, cyanide is bad, for them it's good. And now we've got, at the very basic level of life, normativity, good and bad, and goal-directedness in the sense of you're modulating your interaction with the universe and the way that you're organizing yourself to try to go towards the good stuff and away from the bad stuff. Yeah?
Thinking about this, so viruses aren't considered alive.
That's right.
They hijack things, they replicate themselves in a way,
Yep.
are just like, are they auto-kinesisizing, if you will, or like?
No. So that's one of the kind of, they're really close to being alive, but they don't make their own parts. What they do is trick living things into making parts for them. So they're really close to being alive, but they don't generate a semi-permeable boundary, so they don't exchange matter and energy across a semi-permeable boundary. They just dump DNA into your mitochondria, or sort of into your cells, which then tricks your machinery into making more of them.
You need to have a cell, basically, for this to work.
That's right. Yeah. And all life, as far as we know, is cell-based. So that works as far as we can tell. Yeah.
In the diagram, squiggly just represents the outside world.
Yeah. So this bottom squiggly line is the whole universe. Yeah. That's what the universe looks like. Squiggly line, which, as far as quantum mechanics tells us, is basically right. Quantum wave theory does just tell us that the universe is basically made up of squiggly lines. So, and string theory. So really, it's a very general description. Squiggly line is approximately the universe. That's modern physics for you. Okay. So the point here is that this is the side of the cost-benefit analysis that gives us the benefit part. Probably not to the, I mean, I have trouble understanding how this extends from single-celled organisms to, for example, human beings trying to flourish in the world. Not all of my projects seem to involve me just keeping myself alive. Some of my projects are fancier and subtler than that, I hope. But it at least gives you a kind of baseline level of normativity that you can understand, right? And you can attribute not to full-blown cognitive agents. So in this picture, you get Aristotle's final causes even in single-celled organisms. That is, they have purpose and normativity. They are goal-directed in the following sense. Their goal is to keep themselves a unity and to maintain the distinction between their insides and the rest of the universe. So you get normativity right down, not at the level of chemistry, but at the level of the simplest forms of life. And that normativity underwrites all of life, it underwrites all of cognition, and tells us a little bit about what the benefits side of that, the kind of facts of the matter of the benefits side of that equation. What's keeping me going? And then there's probably more to say about how we cognitively evaluate the benefits of things. I mean, dopamine seems to be one of the ways that the brain does it. If you get dopamine, if you get a little hit of dopamine from something, that's your brain's way of telling you this is important, this is relevant. So there's lots to say about that, but this is at least a way of fixing the facts of the matter on the benefits side of it. So there's the theory of relevance realization as presented by Verveake et al. 2009, I think. And that's as far as we got last time. Quick questions about that before we move on to new stuff. Okay. So let's bring this back to consciousness. So before we started on this relevance stuff, I was telling you that maybe we can understand qualia, the subjective aspects of experience, in terms of what they mean for us. And we did the for us part, sensory motor subjectivity. Then we did relevance in the sense of what it means for us. So just to remind you of the kind of questions that we were asking about consciousness, what is consciousness for seems to be a really important question here. So it's not a question that we typically start from, especially in philosophy, because in philosophy we say consciousness is where you start from. The fact that you are conscious is like the primary data of experience. Which makes the question of what it's for sort of secondary. But I think the question of what consciousness is for is crucially important for defeating the dualist arguments. So if you recall this stuff about philosophical zombies, remember philosophical zombies where You can imagine something that's exactly like you, but it doesn't have consciousness. Well, if consciousness is for something, then that makes philosophical zombies inconceivable. Like you might think you can conceive them, but it's because you haven't thought through this question of what consciousness actually does for you biologically. And if that's right, I mean, if there is some function that it plays in our organism, then you can't actually conceive of something that does everything that we do that lacks consciousness. You can't, because it's like, can you imagine a car that runs without an engine? You say, well, sort of, but not really. Not if you think it through, right? Okay, so today we're going to dig in a little bit to this question of what consciousness is for. And I actually think there's a pretty good answer for this, and it happens to relate back to the relevance stuff. I mean, you're probably not surprised, but it does. Okay, so here it is. Here's the answer. Here's what I think. Here, I'm actually reasonably convinced that this is what consciousness is for. And there's pretty good psychological and neurological evidence that this is something that's going on in our brain. So this is by Shanahan and Bars. Bars has been developing this like since the 80s or something like that. But this is a paper called Applying Global Workspace Theory to the Frame Problem. Global workspace theory is the theory, and they think that it has something to say about the frame problem. This is their argument. And in their claim is the following: consciousness acts as a relevance filter. The job of consciousness, the function of consciousness, is to constrain our information overload and to keep us focused on the relevant information. That's what it does. Okay, so I need to first explain the global workspace theory, and then I can explain how it does this thing about relevance. Okay? Okay, so start with the global workspace theory. Developed by Bars starting in like the 80s, and it's an answer to the question, what is consciousness for? I struggled really hard to remember what this image was about and how it relates to global workspace theory, but I finally achieved it, so by looking at my notes. Let's try a phenomenological experiment, shall we? Please do this with me. I would like you to attend to the sensations at the tip of your right finger. Okay? And now switch to the left finger. Okay. Now here's a question. Can you attend to the sensations at the tip of both fingers at once, or does your attention switch back and forth? Yeah.
Easy solution.
Just put them together. Just conflate the two. Good, good. Any reports on what you experience? Yeah. Back and forth, back and forth. That's what I get too. Yeah, same?
Back and forth, or I can separate them, but each individual sensation isn't as clear.
Right, right, right. Anybody get both at once? Yeah, okay. Some people do report this. Some people do report this. Okay, this is just by way of illustrating the following strange fact about your consciousness. And people who can do both at once, you've just sort of gestalted the two into one object, I think. Yeah, okay. So, but here's a funny thing about your consciousness. It seems to only deal with one thing at a time. Well, what kind of system is that? What kind of silly system is that? That you can only be conscious of basically one thing at a time? Now you can change how big the thing is, right? You can gestalt both of your fingers into one, or you just pay attention to one. But like, why would evolution do this to us? Why would God/evolution make us only be able to pay attention to be conscious of one thing at a time? Yeah.
It's a way of making us serialized and handle a more culpable amount of data with the limited resources that we have.
That's it. I think that's the answer. Yeah, that's the answer. I mean, you could definitely see the benefits of being aware of just everything all the time, right? Because then you wouldn't miss anything. You couldn't be tricked into not being paying attention to something that's important. But then you would face combinatorial explosion. That would be just way too much all at once. So this seeming, like consciousness is in some sense this very small little tunnel into your experience. You could be you could be having experiences of what's going on in your left foot right now. Or you could be having experiences of your own breath. Or you could be having experiences of like the projector. Or like all of these possible things that you have access to, and you're only doing one at a time. It's just like, it's this tiny little tunnel. Yeah?
Didn't we say that that's the spotlight analogy? We said it's not very good.
That's right. The spotlight analogy of attention. Yeah, that's right. So what's inadequate about that is not the belief that you can, that it's narrow, but the belief that just the narrowness is sufficient to understand attention. So what the spotlight attention metaphor of attention left out was all of the depth and complexity of your attention. So you can pay attention to like the sensations on your fingertip, or you can pay attention to the air that's blowing over the fingertip, or you can pay attention to the way that your finger is unified as a whole. So like these are all the same object, but you can flexibly change the way that your attention it sort of strikes the object. So that complexity was what was left out of the spotlight metaphor. But it's nonetheless still true that attention excludes more than it includes. And you might be like, why did God do this to us? This is a bad system. But that's just, well, an issue of parallel versus serial processing. So parallel processing is really fast. It's great to have everything happening at once in some sense. And what you might think that, parallel processing is the way to go. But there's a problem with parallel processing. There's a kind of deep problem with it, a challenge that any parallel processor faces, and especially if we're parallel processors, it's how do you keep everything coordinated? This is a really challenging problem because here's something that's not an answer to that question. Every parallel processor shares all of its information with every other parallel processor. That's a terrible answer because that's just way too much information for any given unit. What you wanted was a bunch of simple little processes all running in parallel so that none of them get overwhelmed. But if you're sharing all of the information between every parallel processor, then every one of them is going to get overwhelmed. That's just like saying every one of these is going to do everything, which you just lost the benefit of parallel processing. So you need some way, if you're being a parallel processor, of keeping these things coordinated on track, pulling in the same direction. Yeah.
Say, like, isn't the other issue of parallel processing kind of getting back to you have to go really big in its design? It's wasteful. So if you're dealing with limited resources, you've got all that extra overhead not in use, and it's just sitting there doing nothing. So you need something variable to go between either serial or parallel.
That's where we're going. That is where we're going. Yeah. Okay, so serial processing is relatively slow because you got to do one thing at a time. It's a pain. You got to do one thing and another thing and another thing, just like your conscious experience. But it's got the benefit of being basically inherently coordinated, right? There's that problem that we had of the serial processors not lining up and doing the job, doing a unified job, doesn't exist with parallel processing, or serial processing, sorry. Serial processing, everybody's on track because you're only doing one thing at a time. So we've got some benefits to parallel processing, and we've got some benefits to serial processing. Now here's an architectural argument about how you want your brain organized. You want the benefits of both without the costs. So you want some aspects of your mind to be parallel and some aspects to be serial. You want the coordination of serial processing, but the speed and flexibility of parallel processing. So this is the proposal for how we actually work in global workspace theory. So what we've got, they suggest, is a whole bunch of unconscious specialist units. A whole bunch of parallel processing specialist units just churning away in the background. And then you've got one central serial processor where information is collected and coordinated. And what happens is, and their suggestion is the following. You've got a whole bunch of unconscious specialist units, and they're in some sense competing for access to the central processor. They're competing for the right, the privilege of coming into consciousness. They're fighting for access to the bars in Shanahan actually use the spotlight metaphor. They use the metaphor of a room full of, an audience, a theater full of people in the dark, sitting in the dark that is unconscious. And they're in some sense fighting for the right to come up on stage and broadcast what they're processing back to all the other specialist units. So this is my favorite analogy for this. Suppose you've got somewhere in your unconscious mind a specialist subunit dedicated to elephant detection. Its whole job, its only job, is detecting whether there's an elephant in the room. And all day long, every object that you focus on, it goes, that's not an elephant, that's not an elephant, that's not an elephant. Now, you probably don't want that in your conscious experience, right? You don't want to have to be doing that. So it's perfectly fine for that to be in the background. But once in a while, you see an elephant. And that unit then goes, holy crap, you guys, holy crap, I see an elephant, you guys, I see an elephant. And it gets really, really excited and temporarily wins the competition for access to the central unit. Because it goes wild. Like, I'm certain of it, you guys, I'm seeing an elephant right now. And then it gets access to the global workspace, and you have the conscious experience of seeing an elephant. And then what happens is, once it's got access to the central global workspace, it broadcasts that information back to all of the unconscious parallel processors. So how do we keep these unconscious parallel processors coordinated? Well, the answer is by having them listen to the global workspace, but not say they don't all get to talk to the global workspace, but they're all listening to it. So they probably listen to a couple of other unconscious specialist units, but they're all listening to the global workspace. And when the unconscious elephant detector wins the competition because it sees an elephant, all of the other specialist units get to hear the message, hey guys, we're seeing an elephant. And then sort of your associations with elephants can get activated, semantic connections, conceptual connections, the parts of you that start planning. Like if you're scared of elephants, then your kind of like amygdala gets to say, oh, okay, now it's time to release some adrenaline, we're gonna get ready to run away from this elephant. Or if you love elephants, then you get filled with dopamine and oxytocin and all that stuff. So this is the basic architecture. And the idea is that this, in some sense, gives you the benefits of specialist parallel processing and the benefits of serial processing, because you need something to keep the specialists coordinated, acting together as a unified whole, but you also don't need them to all be talking to each other all the time. Too much information. Right. So remember we talked about information encapsulation. This was the modules stuff. Now, Jerry Fodor gave us this good argument that your whole mind cannot be informationally encapsulated units, right? Because you need something to deal with relevance. You need something to deal with those context-sensitive aspects of intelligence. Some parts of your mind cannot be simply shunted off to a specialist subprocessor. Some parts of it can. Probably you can do a elephant detector just fine. So just something that watches your visual experience and decides whether it sees an elephant. You can imagine, and it's not that hard, to build a neural network now that could do that task. Just say, is there an elephant in this picture, yes or no? Right? So that's a thing that a specialist unit could do. The thing that Jerry Fodor argued you can't be is massively modular. The whole thing can't be informationally encapsulated. Lots of parts of you can be. Lots of things could be dedicated to a specialist subunit, but not the whole thing. There's got to be at least one part of you that is informationally unencapsulated, that's open to context, that's open to long distance connections, that kind of thing. And that, perhaps, is the global workspace. So, yeah. So, here's this is from Shanahan and Barr's, the relevance paper. Here's how they think it doesn't work. And here's how we said, look, this top diagram is more or less the story that Dennett told us about the robot that was trying to figure out how to deal with relevance in the wagon and the bomb scenario. Remember that? So there's a wagon, it's got a battery and a bomb on it, and the robot was going through the whole list of possible facts available to it, saying, is this relevant? Is this relevant? Is this relevant? Is this relevant? The bomb blows up and the robot dies. It's a very inefficient way of dealing with it. And the built-in assumption of that story was that it was a serial process, right? That's why it's particularly difficult for GoFi to deal with the frame problem, to deal with the relevance problem, because it assumes serial processing. Now, the global workspace theory has parallel unconscious specialists, each asking themselves, am I relevant? Each asking themselves. And if your measure of relevance is well specified, remember that at no point did I tell you that you simply cannot judge relevance except as a fully blown intelligent agent. There are lots of scenarios when you can figure out what's relevant because it's a well specified problem. So in a well-defined problem, in a nicely constrained problem formulation, like you're playing tic-tac-toe, in tic-tac-toe, you know exactly what's relevant. There's not that many facts to track. You can create an algorithm that does all of the relevance realization you need in that little subunit of your mind, right? So there are scenarios where you can ask, where a specialist subunit can ask itself, am I relevant, and get the answer right. Like an elephant detector can say, is that an elephant or isn't it? And that's a well enough defined problem that you can give it to an unintelligent process. So the global workspace hypothesis has the subunits asking, rather than the global central processor asking, are you relevant, are you relevant, are you relevant? Each of the specialist sub-processors are asking, am I relevant, am I relevant, am I relevant? And then if you say, yes, I'm relevant, then you're competing for access to the global workspace. Yeah.
Who came up with this? Verveake came up with this?
No, this is Barr's. Yeah. So this is his theory of this is Barr's theory of consciousness.
So, kind of bringing back to Verveake, we've got a bunch of these swarm machines operating in this global workspace, and they're all, competing, whatever, bioeconomically with each other, and asking, which is the most relevant fitness, if you will, for the situation, and then they solve it.
So yeah, so Verveeke's contribution to this would be a story about how A, B, C, D not necessarily come into being, but how the population of these specialist subprocessors changes over time. So where do these things come from? How do they change across time? How do they remain well fitted to your cognitive environment? The relevance realization story gives us a story about this. And then this architecture, the global workspace hypothesis, gives us something to say about how that relates to consciousness, to conscious experience. Yeah. So, the global workspace has got a few jobs, according to Barr's. Rebroadcast of information is the one I've been talking about. That's an important job of the global workspace. Working memory also seems to be closely related to consciousness. So working memory seems to be only accessible via consciousness. Nothing gets into your working memory unconsciously. It has to pass through consciousness. And if the global workspace is like a way of getting the benefits of both serial and parallel processing, I think this kind of makes sense. So your working memory is where you do things like careful step-by-step reasoning, isn't it? So if you're working on a math problem, if you're working on a logic problem, that's happening in working memory. That's why I'm not very good at those things, because my working memory is not that good. But people, yeah, so that has to go through consciousness. If you're gonna do step-by-step serial processing, you do that using your working memory, and empirical evidence shows when you do psychology experiments on people, you find that nothing gets into working memory except through conscious experience. You have to have a conscious experience before it goes into working memory. In contrast to long-term memory, so you can acquire long-term memories unconsciously. You can get people to have long-term memories that never pass through their consciousness. But working memory seems to be deeply tied to conscious experience, and in some sense, it's your it's your sketch pad. It's your thing that you're working on right now. And language similarly seems tied. Voluntary motor activity similarly seems tied to conscious experience. So if you move voluntarily, that seems to be deeply, deeply tied up with conscious experience. And again, you can think of this, remember the benefits that I said was accruing to us. The problem with parallel processing is that it's hard to keep everybody on the same page. And you really want your left hand to know what your right hand is doing, right? That's literally, like, I know that's an idiom, but it's also literally true that you want your voluntary motor activity to be coordinated, not just like, well, my right hand has a project and my left foot has other interests and we're just gonna see what happens. They can fight for control. No. You want your voluntary motor activity to be extremely well coordinated, and if the job of consciousness is to coordinate these array of parallel unconscious processors, this makes sense that you have to go through consciousness to get to voluntary motor activity. Yeah?
When the information is given to these processors, is it simply fed through, or are these processors also kind of looking at that information almost introspectively and updating their own belief on it? So if you're solving a math problem, and let's say order of operations, you do your brackets and multiplications, so you procedurally break it down. Like, as you're going through that problem, that has to be updating the heuristic in your head, like at a procedural level, at each kind of step in the process. Is a heuristic solving the entire problem as a whole, or is it doing it sequentially like we are?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't think anything in this account really hangs on it, and they don't tell us much about that.
I'm just trying to figure out the communication of, like, is information being given to each of these heuristics, or is the heuristic kind of being selected and then information being piped into it?
So the unconscious specialist units are all, in some sense, listening to what's going on in consciousness, but very often what's going on in consciousness won't be relevant to them. So, sorry, I saw your hand first. Yeah.
So what does he say about, like, parallel experiences like vision, where you're presumably there's a whole bunch of heuristics working that are all passing information simultaneously to something that I guess we're calling them and making it into one experience.
Right.
Like, we're not experiencing a window and then a wall and then a whiteboard, we're experiencing all of those at the same time.
Right. So I think you can tell a story, and it's a really interesting question. I think it's a mildly challenging one for them to deal with, but I think you can tell a story in terms of what we talked about of neural synchrony here. So when the question is, like, who gets access to conscious experience? Your conscious experience clearly isn't just one single visual datum at a time. It's a kind of gestalt. It's a kind of collected, organized whole. So conscious experience seems to be tightly correlated with neural synchrony, and then you can ask how many what group of neurons is being synchronized. So if I'm seeing you in front of a wall and surrounded by people, there's probably some wall detectors and people detectors and you detector all active at the same time, and they all jointly get access to the global workspace. So the collection of it might not just be like one single specialist subunit that gets access to the global workspace. It could be a larger or smaller collection of them that's getting access. And the neurobiological evidence seems to be pretty good that synchrony relates to conscious experience. This is one of the few points at which, especially in visual experience, it's one of the few points at which we've actually got reasonably good evidence for the neural correlates of consciousness. Sorry, is this follow-up?
Yeah, can you just go back over what neural synchrony is again?
Right, so when your neurons are firing at the same rate. Right, so we see this a lot in the brain where the distantly related neurons start firing in synchrony, and that indicates that different parts of your brain are working collectively together. Okay, sorry, I saw your hand first.
Yeah. So this just seems unlikely to me because if everything is supposed to be listening into consciousness, that means every single heuristic, your like all detectors, all memories are always listening in, and that means they're always being fed data from consciousness.
Okay.
That just seems unlikely to me that everything is always being fed data. That seems like a lot of waste, like a big waste of effort. Is it not?
It's a lot of energy. It is a lot of energy. But it might be worth it. It might be worth it. So all of the parts of your brain are affecting all of the other parts. So there's what we know from neurobiology is that there are long distance connections all across the brain. So activity in one part can in fact influence activity in other parts.
Sure, but to say that they're listening in means they're always being fed data. It seems more likely to me
Right.
that it would be rather sending data to the thing.
Right, right.
Like that would mean that the long connections are always firing.
Right, and so that might be right. It might be the case that only some kinds of activity in the global workspace broadcast to other parts. So like, it could be the case that I've got a neural module for moving my leg when I'm walking, and that's just not getting data when I'm thinking about elephants or something like that. It's unclear exactly how data transmission works in the brain at all. The best model we have is this neural synchrony thing, which is a kind of resonance. So it could be the case that you only get resonance when there's some similarity between the stuff going on in the global workspace and the module that receives it, or something like that.
Yeah,
So
I would because then it's influencing like what's listening in.
Yeah,
Then that
yeah.
would explain things like transfer appropriate processing a lot easier, I think.
Interesting. Okay, good. So this is unclear territory exactly how this works, but that's an interesting thought. Thank you. Yeah.
To what degree does information processing go on in the global workspace?
Well, all of your conscious information processing. So if you have the conscious experience of processing information, according to the story, that's happening in the global workspace. So it is a workspace, like it's a space where processing happens.
But is it the global workspace that some sort of machine heuristic thing has taken over temporarily doing the work, or is it the thing that cares about elephants actually doing the processing and just using the workspace as a workspace?
Okay, once again, we're a bit beyond where the science actually is to answer that question. But if the global workspace is the following, then there actually is information processing going on. So the job of the global workspace, we can answer this, based on what the theory is telling us. If the job of the global workspace is integrating information, then what it's doing is taking signals from specialist subunits and integrating them together. So it has to, notice this thing about your consciousness. It's not isolated in time, and it's not isolated in your sense of, in a narrative sense. So what consciousness does is weave your various experiences together into some kind of ongoing coherent whole. And that weaving together is the work that's being done according to this theory in the global workspace. So it's not, your consciousness didn't do the elephant detecting, and you can kind of tell that because you don't have to consciously go through the steps of being like 4 legs, long nose, gray skin, probably an elephant, right? That didn't happen in your conscious experience. What happens in your conscious experience is all of your sensory experiences are being, your memory and your beliefs and your thoughts are all being woven together into a coherent story about yourself. That's the kind of processing that global workspace theory does, at least according to this model. Yeah.
Like, kind of responding to the idea of like we can't be like handling that much data at the same time, like interacting. Like, are we not as like physical entities constantly exchanging information with the environment? Like, it might not be in our global workspace per se,
Yeah.
but our brains, our cells, the atom, whatever you want to subscribe to, it's being constantly bombarded with information, and it's able to handle that.
So we should distinguish a few senses of information. There's information in the physics sense, like information I'm receiving. X-rays are informing my body right now. They're passing through us all in a low levels. In that sense, I'm in some way receiving information from the sun and from distant galaxies and stuff like that. But that's not information in the sense that we're talking about here, right? Here we're talking about information that your brain can use and process and turn into something.
I would respond to like when you're problem solving, you're taking something intangible, this problem, this thing made of something, and then you're taking whatever it's composed of and representing it in the computing medium in your head. And it's somehow being stored in there.
Yeah.
In all of its capacity.
Uh-huh.
And you're able to cope with all that data that's encapsulated in a problem, and then you're able then to abstract with that data. Like the system doesn't seem to be exploding. Like if we can handle the various problems that are otherwise.
So I mean, it's right that we're dealing with huge amounts of information, but it nonetheless does, I think we should never lose sight of the fact that it costs, there's a metabolic cost to the kind of information processing that we do in our brain, the kind of cognitive information processing is metabolically costly. And it's right to say that any moving information from one part of the brain always costs calories. And that's something that your brain is never doing wastefully. It's always trying to do that on the cheap, as it were. Suppose everything that I've just been saying to you is correct. Is that really an answer to the question that was this neurons via magic equals consciousness problem, the hard problem of consciousness? Recall one way of putting the hard problem of consciousness, which is the following. Any process, any neural structure, any information processing architecture that you can imagine, you can always ask, well, okay, fine, we've got that, but why is that conscious rather than unconscious? Why does that feel like something rather than not feeling like anything at all? And that seems to be an extremely general question that you could ask about anything. So I've just told you a story about the global workspace. It's a kind of information processing architecture. It's got some advantages. Maybe our brains are wired up like that. There's some okay neurological evidence suggesting that they are. But a dualist would now say to this thing, if I'm like, here's what consciousness is, you guys, a dualist would now say, well, fine, but why does that feel like something? Like if I wire up my laptop to have a global workspace, is it conscious now? Do I have to respect its autonomy? Do I have to like give it a place at the table of society because it's got some place where it integrates information? Like really, is that all it takes to be conscious? So I might have given you an adequate story of what consciousness is for, but the hard problem seems to remain. The hard problem of answering why does that feel like something rather than not feeling like anything seems to be untouched by that story. So let's spend the rest of this lecture trying to make some progress on that, if at all possible. And I would like to try to make some progress on it by doing the following move. I would like to try to distinguish a few types of qualia. And one of these types, I'm going to try to give you a story about how they fit into this relevance realizing global workspace picture story that I've been telling you. And the other, I'm going to try to give you an argument that maybe we don't need to deal with it. So the part that we're going to sort of try to explain why we've got this type of quality are the adverbial type. And the part that I'm going to try to worm out of having to explain is the adjectival. So an adjective is something that describes a noun, right? Is that right? Really bad with grammar. Adjectives describe nouns. They modify nouns. Okay, so they tells us, for example, the greenness of green. Green is it's noun, it's a thing. Greenness of green. That's the kind of language people use when they talk about qualia. So the painfulness of pain, the saltiness of salt, those are adjectival qualia. And they're the traditional type that philosophers are worried about. Remember this sort of inverted spectrum thought experiment. We would think, well, what if the greenness of my green is like the redness of your red? And then there's this other type of qualia we might call adverbial. An adverb modifies a verb. Got that one faster. Things like here-ness, nounness, and togetherness. And I would say these are aspects of the adverbial quality are aspects of your subjective experience that maybe we can place into our cognitive economy somehow to understand how they play a role in what we're doing and what we're experiencing. And the adjectival qualia, I'm basically going to argue that we don't have much evidence that they actually exist. I mean, I tried the short version of this with asking, for example, like if these don't play a role in our cognitive economy, how do you know that they're there? And don't tell me it's because you experience them, because generating beliefs is a role in your cognitive economy. say. Why do I believe them? Well, because I'm experiencing them. Well, experiences generating beliefs is something that is functioning in your cognitive economy. It's not just sort of sitting there not doing anything. So, yeah.
Could you maybe approach it like they exchange information with their minds so they exist in it?
Any exchange of information is a role in your cognitive economy. So you can't, if you can imagine, like, again, these are the kind of qualia that we imagine were absent from the philosophical zombie. So anything that they do can't be this. Doing something is, so the P-zombie is identical to us in everything that it does. So these qualia are imagined to be something beyond anything that has a role in our thinking and conscious experience, or our thinking process. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to despair of ever understanding or explaining adjectival qualia, and what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about the here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness of conscious experience in terms of like all this stuff that we've been talking about. So let's try it. Maybe we can get a little bit more progress into understanding qualia in this stuff. Okay, so here's a fact about your conscious experience. Almost all the time, assuming that you are not on a lot of drugs or meditating super hard, it's got the following property of being egocentrically organized. That is, it's happening to you, right? Your conscious experience, one of the things that's sort of gripping and grabbing about your conscious experience is that it's happening to you. You are the subject of your conscious experience. Notice that this is a kind of aspectuality. Last time we talked about aspectuality, the fact that when you represent anything, you're representing it under some aspect or other. So you're selectively representing the properties of an object. You're representing some aspects of it. Similarly, your conscious experience only picks out some parts of your universe. It picks out the parts that are relevant to you, right? Your conscious experience is egocentrically organized. It's organized around you as a subject. And that's probably a good place to start, given that you are the one who's most able to organize and deal with your own life. So, you know, well-structured evolution. Thank you for that one. Yeah.
Kind of getting back to the activist, like you're kind of a subject in your own representations. You have some sense of knowledge of yourself, where you're located.
So the enactivists draw on the phenomenological tradition from philosophy, who say that yes, you are an object of your own representations, but you're also, all of your experience assumes your embodiment. So it takes your embodiment as the ground for representing anything at all. And this is a sense of here-ness that's sort of, they do it in a much fancier and longer way through Husserl, but let's not do that here. I can't. I'm incapable. It's a long story. Okay. Okay. So here-ness, this sort of the organization of your conscious experience around you. It's a kind of aspectuality. It's a kind of selecting for relevance, isn't it? Organizing your world egocentrically is organizing it in terms of what matters to you, and that's a sort of fact about what's relevant, how you're tracking what's important in your sensory experience. Nowness is the same thing, but kind of in time rather than in space. So what you're experiencing here's a fact about conscious experience. You're experiencing it as happening now. Once again, if you meditate long and hard enough, this goes away. But almost all the time, almost every conscious experience has this aspect of nowness. Wait, does that go away when no? No, anyway. You've got this, again, aspectuality of experience. Here, it's that you're not just egocentrically organized in space, but temporally organized around what's happening now. I despair of explaining this stuff because it makes my head spin to think about time. So here's an example. We've got all kinds of biases, of temporal biases. So one's called hyperbolic discounting, where if you offer people $5 today, $10 tomorrow, or $200 next year, they'll tend to take the 5 or the 10. In some objective sense, of course, you prefer the $200, right? Objectively, rationally speaking, your needs are probably going to be, unless you expect your needs to be way, way bigger a year from now, but that's sort of unlikely, people will almost overwhelmingly take smaller rewards now than larger rewards far away. And that's a sense in which what you regard as relevant starts from now, right? It's organized around the present moment and fades into the horizon as you get away from what's happening now. So, nowness seems to structure our subjective experience as well. And togetherness. So, conscious experience seems to all, in some sense, hang together. Kant talks about this as the transcendental unity of apperception. So, you don't just get a blob of consciousness over here and then another blob over here, and that they're not really related to each other, right? Does that ever happen to you? That's never happened to me. One of the things that defines consciousness, that seems to be required for consciousness, is that it's in some sense unified, right? You're having an overall experience of being conscious that's integrated with itself. And this is that the parts of your experience are co-relevant to each other, and B, that they seem to be integrated exactly the way that the global workspace suggests that they are integrated. Yeah?
So kind of question is like, here-ness is kind of like a location relevance, and then nowness is kind of
Well-
time relevance, like togetherness kind of glues them together.
Yeah. I mean, space relevance is maybe even not specific, or is maybe too specific, because it's egocentric organization in the sense that how I experience the world is determined by how relevant it is to me as an agent. So, one of your fellow students before class whispered my name, and I got right onto it because it's about me. Whereas if they had whispered somebody else's name, it probably would have passed right through me. So stuff that's relevant to me jumps out at me as vivid and important and clear and all that stuff. And stuff that's relevant to you is like, whatever, I don't care about that much. That's here-ness. So it's not necessarily spatial. Like somebody saying your name from far away is spatially the same as somebody saying my name. But one of them is about me and one of them isn't. So I don't care that much about it.
Like a direct sense of space, but it's more like where I'm in the moment, and then like
Yeah.
what's happening in that given moment, or that moment changing as time progresses.
Yeah.
So as time progresses, it's nowness and kind of where I'm at in the moment is here-ness.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So, like all of this is broadly drawing on stuff from phenomenology, the study of the structure of consciousness. There's a lot of debate in that field, but there does seem to be some facts about conscious experience, like its structure, that we can meaningfully talk about. Right? We can ask questions about like how and why is my conscious experience organized around me rather than being sort of objective in some way. How and why is my conscious experience organized temporally? So your global workspace seems to be organizing your conscious experience in ways that help you decide what to do. That's why it's got here-ness. I want to know what I should do because I'm the one who can control me. Right? So it's organized around me and my abilities to act in the world. It's now because I want to know what to do now. And it's together because I want it to be coherent. I want it to be what your conscious experience is largely consists of is a relatively coherent story that your brain is telling you about yourself. Your position in the world, the kind of person you are, your relationship to the world, your activities in it, your effects on it, causes of the world on you, causes of you on the world. So conscious experience is putting all of this disparate information together into some kind of story that you can then use to try to make decisions in the future. Yeah? And so here's a whole bunch of facts about your qualia, at least the adverbial sense of your qualia, right? The ways in which your conscious experience is structured in motion, in activity. Really don't have much to give you in terms of explaining the adjectival aspects of experience. The greenness of green, the saltiness of salt, the painfulness of pain. Yeah.
So there's like, did you give us like an example of like nowness in regard to like greenness of green? As in like, what I'm, like the trees that's like, that's green to me, or where I mean, spectrums?
Those are totally different types of aspects of, so I can't give you anything about the greenness of green. In fact, everything that I can give you about adjectival qualia fails to express them, doesn't it? Like there's nothing that I can say, there's very little I can say about adjectival qualia, because I can point to the tree and say that's green for me, and I can tell you about my feelings about green. I can tell you about associations and memories and all that stuff, but none of that, according to the classic conception of qualia, is the qualia. All of that is the stuff that's associated with greenness, not with the subjective experience, the qualitative aspect of greenness.
I'm just trying to group like here this nowness together, and that's like a real world example for each one. Like,
Yeah.
can you give any?
I thought I just did. I thought I just did.
Like what you're like feeling in the moment, like as an individual.
Well, I experience my subjective experience as organized around me, right? And it's my experience. All of my subjective experiences belong to me in some sense. I say, this is my experience. And I experience them as happening now, and I experience them as unified. I mean, that's the story of this stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to clarify, so the problem with adjectival aspects of qualia is
Yeah.
that they're unique to each individual person.
Well, one.
That they fail to define the qualitative experience by definition because it's different amongst every person. Like that's what I got from it.
Okay, so one thing that it's hard to. For me, the problem with talking about adjectival qualia is precisely that you can't explain anything about them in some sense. Like when I say I'm seeing red, the redness of red, and this is the thought experiment. You say, what if when I see red, it's what you see when you see green? And there's no way of proving or disproving that that's true or false. For me, that's the problem. That there's just no way of showing that that is the case or isn't the case.
Oh, okay. So it's just the idea that it's sort of hard to explain.
It's hard. You can't express it in words. It's ineffable. It's intangible, and by definition, they have no effect on how we act or judge the world.
Oh, okay.
Which makes me think that they aren't there. Yeah.
Is that potentially problematic for artificial intelligence? Because presumably two different thinking machines would very much agree on what the greenness of green is.
Well, how would you know that the two different thinking machines are experiencing the same thing as green? The exact same question arises for artificial intelligence as is for us.
Well, I guess it's just partly because they have presumably you'd have like some camera feeding them information so that they'd be being fed the same information.
We're being fed the same information.
But it's maybe ambiguous where it eventually gets processed, whereas I don't.
It's in the brain. It's in the brain.
But maybe your green sensor is my red sensor kind of thing.
Well, okay, so the rods and cones we know are the same. The basic visual processing we know is the same. The deep inner processing, we don't know how it works, but even if we did, it still wouldn't be an argument against the inverted qualia thought experiment. It still wouldn't be an argument that the subjective aspect of your experience, the adjectival qualia, are the same in me as in you, because the adjectival qualia don't make a difference to the way the information is processed. And that's why you could have, if the inverted spectrum thought experiment is coherent, then it can't make any difference to the way the information is processed. Similarly, if the p-zombie thought experiment is coherent, you can lose these entirely without making any difference to the way you're processing information. And again, the p-zombie thought experiment is atom for atom identical brains. So that by assumption, these things make no difference to the internal process of cognition. It's just that the conscious experience is different. And if you think that that doesn't make any sense, then that's what I think too. I think that that doesn't make any sense. So we should, in some sense, give up on these things and say, I don't think that these things exist in any meaningful sense. If you define these things as somehow permanently beyond our ability to explain scientifically, then you should just be like, and somehow outside of our cognitive process, then we have no evidence that they exist, and we have no reason for explaining them. That's my thought. Yeah.
Is all adjectival qualia sensory?
Yeah. So they're all supposed to be sensory experiences. Or wait a minute. All of the examples that I've ever been taught have been sensory, but maybe there's something that it's like to have a thought. It's an interesting question.
Because sensory memory tends to last like less than a second.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it's not processed as much.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it evokes feelings in the consciousness to be recorded.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Just to piggyback on that, I mean, so could you have said like, what's the happiness of happy? Would that be another example?
Good. Yeah. So that would be an adjectival qualia, and you can talk. I mean, it's certainly you can talk about the kind of like, oh, it makes my skin tingle and it makes my steps lighter, and you can talk about all of the actual causal effects that happiness have on you. But if there's some like ineffable essence of happiness, just like there's an ineffable essence of seeing red, then I don't know what that is, and I don't think we're sort of obliged to explain it. Yeah.
If we get the sandbox of like heuristics in the global workspace theory, and they're all competing and these little critters are all going about.
Yeah.
If like one machine has a different ecosystem of them and another machine has a different ecosystem of them, wouldn't that be able to accept this kind of quality? Like one machine's interpretation of breeding based off of its ecosystem of heuristics will be different than another machine's ecosystem of or understanding of breeding because of its different ecosystem of heuristics. Like this
Yep.
is working that way.
Oh yeah. So there's nothing incompatible about us being internally diverse and being made up of a whole bunch of different machines with adjectival qualia. It's just that I don't know what job they're doing in any explanation. So at the personal level or even at the subpersonal level, I don't know what job they're doing.
So it's still really the heuristic that we don't know.
Well, it's not, a heuristic does something for you, and these things don't seem to do anything for you. Okay, let me do one more theory of consciousness for you that I think helps maybe, I don't know. So at this point in the course, Verveake typically says, I don't know, hard problem of consciousness, it still exists, we're still wrestling with it. Let me do one more move here to try to make a positive case that we should not worry about adjectival qualia. So this is a theory called the self-model theory of consciousness. It's developed by Thomas Metzinger in his wonderful book, Being No One, the self-model theory of subjectivity. He's got some TED Talks where he summarizes this if you want the short version. And he's got a shorter book called The Ego Tunnel. So a bunch of resources if you want to learn about this. But here's his theory of consciousness, basically. His theory is something like this, and I think it's reasonably compatible with everything that I've been saying so far. It's just another slice through the pie. His belief is, his argument is, so the book is called Being No One. He actually argues that there's no such thing as a self, and that what you think is your selfhood, your experience of selfhood, is a kind of elaborate illusion. So, take this with a grain of salt, but his argument is the following. He says, look, here's what your conscious experience is. It's a simulation that your brain is running of your world. It's your brain's best guess, its best simulation of what's happening right now. And furthermore, it's a simulation that you cannot stop confusing for the thing itself. You're hardwired to mistake your simulation for reality. That's his theory of what your subjective experience consists of, is a kind of model that you're hardwired to confuse for the thing itself. So I think I'm seeing a table, and I'm convinced that that's the table right there, but my experience is of a simulation of a table that I'm permanently unable to distinguish from the reality. Yeah?
So does this imply that there is a reality that we can experience, but reality is like
Like, it's unclear to me what he thinks about that. I think there's two ways of. So let me give you one more part of this that you're already familiar with, and then we can see what you think about it. So there's a couple different views you can have of this. So Metzinger, remember this transparency opacity stuff from back in Insight stuff? That came from Metzinger. That came from this book, and his argument is that your self model. So you got a model of yourself, you got a model of your world, and you got a model of your self-world relations. A bunch of models kind of all integrated with each other, and this model tends to be very strongly transparent. That is, you see through it, you do not see it. So you do not see it as a model. You see through the model towards the world. So, and this is a kind of systematic error that we all make pretty much all the time. Okay, so you can see through some aspects of your experience. You can do transparency opacity shifts for a bunch of stuff. So we did them in the tapping experiment. Remember this? Where you're tapping, and you can sort of either experience the bottle through your fingertip, or you can experience your fingertip, or you can tend to just, not even your fingertip, but the sensations. But he thinks that there's a kind of, well, in this book, he argues there's a kind of limit point where you can no longer do the transparency opacity shift. You can no longer see, you can no longer look at the model, you can only ever look through it. Okay, so one thing that you could take away from this is that we are just permanently stuck in this delusion, that there's no way of getting out of it. That seems to be what he implies in the book. But he's also way into like Buddhism and psychedelics. So, and those both sort of seem to imply, I'm not saying this about it, it's in the book. I mean, it's not rumors, he's writing about it. So, and that seems to imply the possibility that you could do that final transparency opacity shift and see the model as a model. And what that would entail is, in some sense, your sense of self disappearing. Because if your sense of self is generated by this hardwired or semi-hardwired transparency, then doing that final transparency opacity shift means that you no longer have, in some sense, conscious experience, because conscious experience is a systematic illusion that your brain is tricking you with. I've heard, and I don't speak Sanskrit, but I'm told that the best translation of the Buddhist term enlightenment is more like snuffing out the candle. And that would be, it's endarkenment would be a better translation of enlightenment in the Buddhist sense, where you're putting out the final illusion that's causing you all your suffering of being a stable, permanent self, of confusing your model of reality for reality itself. I think you can see degrees of this. Some people just cannot distinguish their experience of the world from the world itself. You're like, no, he's just being a jerk. It's like, no, you're hungry and kind of cranky. It's in your experience, but it's not in the world, right? So sometimes you can see people doing this in sort of simplistic ways of being unable to distinguish their model from the reality. And Metzinger says, we've got that kind of error just permanently built in. And that might be, I would like to suggest, maybe why we people feel so insistent that we've got this adjectival qualia, that there's something that it's like to see greenness, because they can't do that final transparency to opacity shift. They can't see that this is, there's something ineffable there. I'm like, yeah, that's the systematic illusion. That's the trick that your brain is playing on you, causing you to think that you're experiencing reality directly when all you're experiencing is the model. Yeah.
So you're saying like we can't effectively self-document unless
you can self-document many layers of your cognition, but there's a final layer that we're sort of, and he makes a good argument for this. Like, why is it that our brain would be constantly tricking itself? Well, another thing that you simulate is a lot of imaginary worlds, and you want to be anchored in this one, right? You don't want to confuse your imagination for your simulation of reality. So like when you're planning or when you're imagining, those are also kind of simulations, but you can see through them, can't you? You can tell that this is a model, not reality. And you don't want to have your imaginations and plans confused for your model of what's actually going on. So your brain kind of anchors you in this one by not letting you do that transparency opacity shift. That's his argument for why we would be set up that way by evolution. Anyway, so if that's right, then it might help explain why we're so insistent on these things being there. Yeah. Oh yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's a Musk. The simulation argument is that argument is that all of reality is within a simulation. And it might be the case that people find that argument, I think it's a very weak argument actually. It might be the case that they find that argument attractive because individually we are living in our brain's simulations of the world, and you have some distant sense of this. Gnostic religions and the whole New Age movement is steeped in this stuff. The belief that we are in a kind of illusion that we're almost ready to break out of. And that might be symptomatic of the phenomenal self model being permanently transparent. I don't know. This is, I'm wildly speculating now, but okay. Yeah.
I was going to say, he subscribes to the belief that the data that we are simulating, we're not directly interacting with the world. That like as data comes in, we're constructing this kind of veil that comes down that we have to then interact with the world with. Use the term simulating kind of the world.
Yeah.
We exist in the world. We are entities in the world as like physically embodied.
Yeah, he certainly believes that we're in the real world. We're actually here. We're actually embodied. All of that is true. But like, what would it be to experience the real world directly? Like, what is that? That is no longer doing it aspectually, maybe. Like, no longer doing it from you can break down some parts of this, right? So you can break down the notion that you're egocentrically organizing the world. You can break down the sense of spatially, temporally organizing the world. This happens to people sometimes. But yeah, so I really don't know what it would mean to experience the world directly. Yeah.
Science, though, like any of our perception, doesn't work like that, or so far it doesn't work like that. We're always seeing like an event as a response, something that's positive, thinking about the fact that we can't fully, tangibly understand an atom. Like we only construct a model of understanding around.
Yeah.
It could be totally different.
Yeah.
But is that what he's kind of saying, that there should always be this level of misunderstanding of reality?
Well, just that what your brain is doing is constructing a simulation in the sense of a coherent picture. So I think I did this before with you, but like the fact is that your eyeballs are, consider your visual experience, your eyeballs are darting around all the time. It's doing what's called saccades. And during the saccade, you're blind. You can't see anything. But you don't experience your visual stream as being like full of jumps and cuts, do you? You experience a smooth, continuous visual experience. Your brain is doing heavy editing to all of your sensory experience to make it into a coherent picture of reality. So I guess if you dropped the transparency opacity, you'd see the saccades. You would feel the way that like I'm only visually, you only get like this much clear stuff and the rest is blurry. Right? You can barely resolve details outside of your focal center. So like maybe you would experience like, oh, I have a bunch of jumpy, blurry, cutty stuff that's barely coherent, and what your consciousness is nicely doing for you is sewing that all together into a convincing, stable picture of reality. Yeah.
On that same topic,
Yeah.
Currently everybody sees everything upside down.
Oh,
Your mind just does
right.
the correction.
Right. So yeah. So in your in your actual eyeball, the projection of the image is upside down, but fortunately it doesn't show it to you. Your brain doesn't show it to you upside down. Thank you once again, brain, for not giving us accurate information, but rather trying to give us a helpful simulation of what's going on. Yeah?
Have you watched the movie Source Code?
No, I haven't. Source code.
Yeah, with Jake Gyllenhaal, I think.
No, I haven't. Should I?
I mean, that was the only thing that I was thinking while
Yeah.
hearing about this, because the whole plot of the story is that he's an ex-military survivor.
Yeah.
Basically, the only things that are left of him, theoretically, from Hollywood is his brain and, the top part of his head.
Yeah.
So what they do is they put him in a simulation, and they can go back in time repeatedly throughout, his memory. So they tap into, the part of his brain that deals with memory to look for this,
Yeah.
suspected bomber.
Okay.
Train.
Yeah.
He has to live in that moment, a gazillion times.
Ooh.
And, there's, shatters, and, every time this
Right.
cause,
It's-
he starts, tripping out.
Okay. Okay.
Pretty sick.
Excellent. Excellent. This course has been a rich source of good sci-fi suggestions for me. And I really appreciate that. Good. So, okay. So, all right. That was odd. But that was my last gasp attempt at trying to make an argument that yes, we need an explanation. We need to understand the adverbial aspect of qualia. We need to understand how it's related to we need to understand how our subjective experience means something, how it means something to us, and how it's structured. Yeah?
Clarify. So a sense of self is generated by consciousness.
That's the thought, yeah.
And our consciousness, according to this theory, is our model of reality.
That's right. That's right.
How do you generate your model of reality? Right? Isn't that generated by your sense of self?
Well, and so that's precisely what your sense of self is a kind of a feeling of, so it's a model that your brain is building. Your brain is building a kind of predictive model of reality, and it's got a map of your body, it's got a map of your world, and it's got a map of the relation between the two, and what your sense of self is, according to the Metzinger's being no one model, is precisely just you being unable to identify that sense as a model rather than as reality. You permanently confuse that model with reality itself. Yeah. Freaky, no? Yeah.
But I would almost go as far as to say, reality has, it doesn't make sense outside of a subjective model.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so the idea that you could, so this tempts the notion that we could just break out of the model and get to reality itself, but that might be confused. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. I think that's right. So the tempting metaphor is a veil put before your eyes, and then what that makes you think is you can just pull away the veil and see the real thing. But that's not really sensible, because you can only access reality from a point of view. That's it. Okay. So just to see where we've got, these are the challenges that we started the AI process with. These are the things that Descartes said, well, look, you can't give me a scientific answer to this, you mechanists. The paradox of mechanical reasoning. And if the relevance realization story is right, then we've given an answer to this. We had to change what we meant by analysis to get there. We had to stop thinking in terms of just the parts of systems and think of how they're organized as wholes. But if that story works, then we've got an answer. The problem of subjective experience, I am less confident that I've given you a solid answer to that one, but we've done some sketches, some initial essays about what maybe that story could possibly look like. Hopefully we've gotten to the point where we're no longer willing to just say to the dualist, yes, the hard problem is utterly unassailable and there's just no way to even think about it. So that's many philosophers think that the hard problem of consciousness is so hard that we can't even begin to think about how to deal with it. And I've been trying to make the case today and yesterday, or today in the last couple of classes, that I don't think I gave you an answer to the question of consciousness, but I think I gave some possible roads about how to maybe think about it. And then there's this third thing, the problem of original meaning, which I did not give you anything at all about. I have no idea how to deal with this one. I have no resources for you. But hey, you know, life is long. Maybe there's some roads to be made here. So that's I have to sort of leave that as an open question. Okay, so as a way of wrapping up, this is our last class. As a way of wrapping up, I thought I'd go through this. At the very beginning of this course, I promised that this whole course was an argument, one consistent argument for a conclusion. And I thought I would do what's called an argument diagram for the course, and we could just walk through it and talk about the structure of the argument. Now, I want to flag right away, this sheet that I just handed out to you is not a study sheet. So this sheet by no means contains all of the relevant information for the exam. That's not what we're doing right now. We're not going to do a review of the whole course in the final hour. What we're going to do, however, is try to see how the whole course hangs together as a whole. That's the project right now, to see how it's all integrated together. There's probably a bunch of different ways of putting it all together as a coherent whole. This is my best shot at it, though. So, okay, we're gonna have to take it, I've got 15 premises and a conclusion, so we're gonna have to take it chunk by chunk. So let's start with premises 1 to 7, and let me just explain how I think the diagrams work. So this is a argument mapping technique I teach in critical reasoning courses to sort of draw out the structure of an argument. The arrows represent justification. So premise 1 here justifies premise 2. And when there's a horizontal line, the two premises together justify the conclusion. And they're both kind of necessary. When there's a line underneath them, they're both necessary to justify the thing that the arrow is pointing at. Is that fairly clear? I spent like 5 weeks explaining this thing in critical reasoning, so I hope that that's roughly clear what's going on. But it's just to note, the arrow is the justification relation. So let's quickly go through this. So premise 1, cognitive science needs to satisfy the naturalistic imperative, answering Descartes' challenge to Hobbes. That is the problems of mechanical reasoning, subjective experience, and original meaning. So it's a complex premise. But cognitive science needs to come up with a naturalistic account of the mind. That's premise 1. And that's supposed to justify that to do that, we need to find a basic cognitive process that we can analyze into non-cognitive operations. So if it's true that we need that we need to satisfy the naturalistic imperative, that justifies the belief that we need to find some basic cognitive process. Okay, so P1 to P2, and then P3, 4, and 5 represent the first third of the entire course, which is categorization looks like such a process, but relevance screwed us up. P4, memory looks like a basic process, but relevance screwed us up. P5, problem solving looks like such a process, but relevance screwed us up. Yeah? So all three of those together, the first third of the course all joined together, are supposed to justify the premise 6, that all of the basic candidate processes presuppose relevance realization. And then P2 and P6, we need to find a basic cognitive process to analyze into cognition into. Relevance realization seems to be required for all of our candidate processes. Therefore, we need a theory of relevance realization. Yeah? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so just go through these really quick with a few comments. Any questions you got, please just shout them out kind of thing, because this should be familiar, right? So P1, we're just describing the basic project of COG250, coming up with a naturalistic account of the mind. A question that you might ask here is that do we need a answer the question of subjective experience in order to deal with cognition? So remember the distinction I made between cognition and consciousness? So if you could build an AI that just did all of the work that a cognitive agent does and didn't bother to give it consciousness, did we do cognitive science? Like maybe. So it depends in some sense on what you think the overall goal of the project is. So just a thought. to satisfy the naturalistic imperative, we need to find a basic cognitive process. This is just science, right? You believe premise 2 because that's how science works. You take things apart into their parts and understand their parts, or you identify a multiply realizable or overall organization and explain it mathematically. Did we end up with one basic cognitive process? Sort of, maybe. All right, and then categorization looks like such a process, but relevance messed us up. So just recall, this happened with a similarity-based account of categorization because it presupposed relevance, like explicitly. There was a variable in there for like salience, which is just another way of saying relevance. We rejected the classical theory kind of because it ignored the problem of relevance. It's like a micro world for the categorization literature. Like the classical theory functions precisely by pretending you don't need to worry about relevance. And microtheory or theory seem to just presuppose relevance, not just relevance realization, but problem solving in general. Okay, so that was that branch of this thing. Memory, we said, was reconstructive, not reproductive. And the way that your memory reconstructs the world is in such a way that it is relevant to you. So it presupposed relevance. Problem solving, non-insight problem solving, doesn't presuppose relevance realization in any robust sense, right? So don't tell me on the exam that all problem solving requires relevance realization, but insight problem solving does. That's where you have to figure out what the relevant operations are, what the relevant problem formulation is. Okay? And that's from 3, 4, and 5. All of the basic candidate processes seems to presuppose relevance realization. That was the big takeaway from the psychology section. And those come together to say we need a theory of relevance realization. We could add another premise here. So I've left out the distinction between a theory of relevance and a theory of relevance realization. We might add another premise leading to P7 that relevance is not a homogeneous class. You could if you want. Assume that you don't get to have a theory of relevance. And I made that argument fairly explicitly. Okay, so far so good? Okay, now here's another branch of this thing. So an independent branch from all of that. We started doing AI research. We saw that GoFi represents cognition as formal symbol manipulation. And then the frame problem seems to show that formal symbol manipulation cannot capture relevance or relevance realization. Yeah?
Kind of getting back to the last lecture of what you said, like, are we basically kind of going backwards from that, this flow chart of yours? So like this theory of kind of relevance realization, he's proposing a swarm intelligence method that then gives rise to these basic cognitive processes at the very top, as well as the workspace kind of idea. So it's kind of like going backwards in the sense of what you described. Like we've got heuristics that then give rise to like relevance, and then they give rise to categorization. And then
yeah, something like that. Something like that. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so GoFi had it as formal symbol manipulation. Frame problem shows you that formal symbol manipulation can't be the whole story. So frame problem plus the finitary predicament. Therefore, GoFi can't provide a model for relevance realization. There was that. So this was just, P8 is pretty easy to justify. It's just the definition of computation that Hausland developed. So the argument for this one is basically, if we try to pre-specify relevance in the rules, we hit combinatorial explosion. So you could pre-specify all possible contexts to give formal rules for every possible situation you could be in. There's way too many rules. If we allow context to matter to how symbols are manipulated, then you just gave up the whole GoFi game. Right? You just decided that that's not going to work. Therefore, GoFi can't provide a model for relevance realization. That's a pretty strong conclusion, but we justified it, I think. I justified it using both conceptual arguments, that is the frame problem stuff, and also just the fact that the GoFi project crashed and burned. Like, as a matter of fact, we dumped huge amounts of money and human effort into it, and it didn't pan out. So that's an empirical piece of evidence to complement our theoretical arguments. Okay, so there's that branch. I should have done something about connectionism. I left out connectionism entirely in this thing. So I guess I rolled connectionism into self-organized processes. So okay, so here's another branch of the argument. Multiple realizability is necessary for AI, which is necessary for mechanization. Self-organized dynamical systems offer us a form of multiple realizability, and self-organized dynamical systems can avoid the frame problem by acting in a context-sensitive way without hitting combinatorial explosion. And those three things together are supposed to establish the premise that self-organized dynamical systems can provide a theory of relevance realization. Okay, so let's go through those. So we need multiple realization. GoFi is not going to do it. So self-organized dynamical systems give us a kind of multiple realizability, and you can think of, I think it's fair to think of connectionist networks at their most advanced as a type of self-organized dynamical system. So the more advanced a neural network seems to be, the more self-organized it is. Deep learning, the wake-sleep algorithm, generative adversarial networks were the sort of fancier versions of this. The better they get, the more we've set them up just by letting them organize themselves. So I'd call that a self-organized system. And it gives us a kind of multiple realizability. And this one, self-organization can also avoid the frame problem by acting in a context-sensitive way without hitting combinatorial explosion. The argument for this was that extended analogy with evolution. So evolution by natural selection, where evolution by natural selection acts in a context-sensitive way. It takes everything into account. It doesn't have to, there's no limit to how many details and how finely natural selection can consider the context it's in. So it's context-sensitive. Nonetheless, it doesn't have a problem with combinatorial explosion because it's not processing this in any centralized way. It's processing it in a distributed way. It's sort of letting the process unfold and self-organize. So that's why self-organization provides us a way of being context-sensitive without hitting combinatorial explosion, unlike computation. Yeah?
In a self-organizing system, they hook up to like a ton of moved GoFi systems that then kind of do their thing.
Absolutely.
What would you classify it
As a mixed system. And the best AI we've got right now is exactly like that. So it's some kind of self-organizing neural network with traditional programming. And the traditional programming handles the well-defined aspects of the problem, and the self-organizing part handles the ill-defined or the messy bits of the problem, and the combination of the two. And at the end of the connectionist literature bit, I suggested that we might be a combination of the two as well. So we do logic, we do language. Maybe we've got a neural network that instantiates a computation in limited situations. So we've probably got both going. But it's the self-organized bit that does the context-sensitive parts of cognition. Okay, so self-organized dynamical systems can provide a theory of relevance realization. So that's a big premise. That's controversial. Don't go to cognitive scientists from another university and say, it's been clearly established that this is true, because there's a debate about this. But I hope to have given you some reasonable arguments, and I'm reasonably convinced that we've got the beginnings of an analysis. At least an analysis in the sense of knowing what the right type of theory is, what the elements of the theory are, moving towards a formalization. So that's the stuff about relevance realization that we did on Tuesday. Formalization and mechanization would be cool too. Look forward to robots that can do relevance realization. That would be nice, but one thing at a time. Okay, and then all of that. So now we've got the conclusion from a bunch of those sub-arguments all coming together to the overall conclusion. We need a theory of relevance realization. Self-organization could give that to us, and a dynamical systems theory of relevance realization coupled with the theory of autopoiesis, can help us explain consciousness. That's been the argument from the last 2 lectures. So, like, the whole philosophy of the whole last third of the course is in this premise. I could have done a lot more detail on this final premise. We talked about consciousness as a relevance filter. Sorry, not last time, but this time. And if the theory of relevance realization presented is right, then it gives us analysis which can help explain that. So, the conclusion is we got 2 out of the 3. Or we got 1 decently dealt with, 1 we're working on it, and 1 which is a big question mark. Which is a pass, I guess. That's 50%. 1.5 out of 3, that's a pass. So if we had if cognitive science has credit, no credited the whole project, then it gets the credit. Okay, so there you go. That was supposed to be the overarching argument of the whole course. You don't have to believe it, but I think it's better to try to give you some sort of narrative than just to throw a bunch of facts at you. Anyway, that's it, everyone. See you at the exam. Thank you very much.